Today we're going to explore the poem Nick and the Candlestick by Sylvia Plath. We're going to try and look at it through a broader perspective rather than just looking at it as Sylvia Plath's personal experience. Of course it is her experience, but it does, I think the poem, presents a speaker in her poem, and she speaks from the voice of mothers. Okay, and so it's looking at motherhood and the experience of motherhood rather than just Plath's personal experience. So if we look at the title of the poem, Nick and the Candlestick, there is an allusion to the nursery rhyme Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick. And you know, this suggests that it's going to be a really positive, exploration of the relationship of childhood and the adventures and all those sort of things that are related to that. So a very positive connotation, and of course appropriating Nick, Jack be nimble to Nick is a connection to her child Nick, of course. Okay, the poem is built on a conceit. And a conceit is where it's basically a metaphor where you take two seemingly unlike objects and you make them compare to each other. You look and see how they relate to each other. So motherhood is compared to mining, being a miner. Okay, and so the way in which Plath does that is looking at motherhood as a dark, isolating and a dangerous experience. Okay, and the way in which she develops that idea right at the beginning of the poem is through this opening line, I am a miner, the light burns blue. And so here she's comparing herself to a miner and saying that the flame that she's carrying is really depleted, and that's meant to represent that motherhood is a really draining experience, and that she's facing, that women face exhaustion and depletion. It's a really scary sort of process that generally or quite often women were encountering and experience in isolation, and so she's presenting this idea of the flame in the candle is really starved of oxygen, really exhausted. It's barely able to function, and it's not shedding too much positive light. Okay, so it's a really nice way of presenting the situation or the perspective of how mothers feel at this time. I've put here that these two sentences in the opening line, they are short, emphatic sentences that establish a fact or the truth. And we could also say that this is an end-stop line because it is complete within the line, and that creates an emphasis as well, you know, and establishes that truth. Then, as she develops in the coming stanzas, she is expressing or exploring her womb as a cave, and she calls it the old cave of calcium. So we have a metaphor here that the womb is a cave, and that once it was full of life and vitality, but now it is desolate and barren. So there's a real sense of sadness and remorse, and that it seems as though to mothers, that you know, when you think about it biologically, that's a female's purpose, and so there is a sense of sadness and emptiness, and you know, like it's the images there really expressing ideas of decay and desolation. And as a result of this, the speaker of the poem is aware of her own mortality, and her womb is described as cold and white, and that's a very morbid image, and it's you know, associated with corpses, you know, and there are lots of images that give this impression that there is no hope and purpose left in the speaker's perspective. And then she talks about there being newts, and that inside the cave there are fish that the miner's in. And she describes the fish as a piranha religion, drinking its first communion. And, you know, so she's establishing that and, you know, the fish is sucking on the miner's toes, but really it's meant to be the breastfeeding experience, and that it's established like a pagan ritual sacrifice where it's not about the mother nurturing the child. It's more that the mother feels like the life force is being drained out of her in some sort of ritual sacrifice. And so there are all these really raw and you know, sort of really bold statements about how vulnerable and how exhausted the mother is feeling in this experience. And of course, you know, we're talking about confessional poetry, and so it is exposing those vulnerabilities and those emotions that generally don't get spoken about. And also, after she talks about the piranha religion, the next line is about the fish having a vice of knives, and which, you know, it's saying the piranha's teeth are biting into the toes, and the breastfeeding experience metaphorically is emphasising the mother's pain and suffering. And so it's really enhancing the poet, or the subject of the poem's feeling of isolation and helplessness. And this is certainly present in the first half of the poem. So we've explored the first half of the poem, and now we get to the middle of the poem. There are 14 stanzas in this poem, and we've looked at the first 7. When we get to the 8th line, we see a shift in tone. And the line is, "The candle gulps and recovers its small altitude." So we get this idea at the start of the poem, the light burns blue. The flame is being, it's the feeling of suffocation almost, isn't there? That you know, the poet, the subject of the poem, feels like that miner trapped underground. There's a lack of oxygen, and it's a suffocating atmosphere, and it's a really a real feeling of fear and anxiety, and then when we get to this point, we have a focal shift where the mother has been thinking about herself, and then she changes the focus to the child, and as a result the candle gulps in the oxygen. So we move from a feeling of from suffocation into more of a feeling of saturation. There's so much oxygen, and the flame extends. And I think you feel like that if you could show it physically, that, you know, the feeling would be you'd be weighed down, and then, you know, and then you're revived, and so that's the metaphoric mood that the poem has created. It recovers its small altitude. Okay, so what this is saying is, you know, the poem is shifting to focus on the child, and as a result, the child provides the mother with purpose. His light guides her way, gives the mother direction. The next thing that occurs is there is the use of alliteration. The blood blooms clean in you, Ruby. And so, first of all, we've got this image of purity. You know, that there are purities within the blood of the child, because he's innocent and beautiful. He's an image of perfection. And the child is unafflicted by the mother's fears and apprehensions. So Plath talks about these notions of sin and corruption and things like that. So she's rejoicing in the fact that she knows that he does not have that affliction. And then she uses a ruby, a gemstone metaphor there to show that like the miner's reward, the ruby, the child, is precious and rare, and it's highly sought after. And so that the influence of the child really revives and restores the mother's love, and it really clarifies her identity. So she's not presented as an empty vessel. She is a nurturer, and she has a real purpose in her life. and that obviously, you know, is why the flame has intensified. Then we come to this line and we can say it's using imagery or symbolism. Love, love, I've hung our cave with roses. And notice here we've got the personal pronoun of our, that first person. But the roses are symbolic, obviously, aren't they, of love, and it's emphasised here. It's pretty obvious that she's you know, expressing her love for a child, and what that does is it shows that she has a really strong connection. So she's no longer the minor isolated. She has that connection, and that's a really clever idea, I think, that she explores there. And then we've got an example, I think, of overstatement. So a lot of the time she'll downplay, use meiosis, and say, I've done it again, that type of thing. But here she's saying, let the stars plummet to their dark address. And so basically she's saying the whole universe can end, but I'm content. I've got what I need. So it's showing her sense of satisfaction, and she has a place of understanding and contentment. And then the poem concludes with the religious allusion, you are the baby in the barn. So that's a reference to Jesus Christ, and he was the salvation. So what the child provides is the mother with a sense of direction and purpose, and he is her salvation. He provides her with that clear identity, and that drives the purpose. So I think that the poem is a really good poem to explore, and there's a lot in it. And what it certainly does is it captures the anxieties of motherhood, not just in Plath's time frame, but in all times. But when we look at Plath's, you know, it was the conservative 1960s. There were many issues such as these anxieties of motherhood that were taboo topics. They weren't to be discussed. And so Plath's confessional poetry is an avenue to unite women who share that same experience, because you know, having a child is a beautiful experience, but it is incredibly stressful and daunting for many. And so this is developing a position of strength, because it is emphasising the collective struggle, and as a result she's shifting that idea from being an experience that one must endure all on your own to being this collective experience. And it reinforces this idea that there is strength through the primal connection between mother and child, and that you're never alone in that sense. So there's a lot of connection and strength in the statement that she makes. And finally, I think that I do like this idea of exploring the poem as a statement of female identity. I think that looking at that, you could compare and make connections to many poems like Lady Lazarus and Fever 103, and start exploring ideas like sexuality and performativity and this constructed notion of gender identity. You know, those sort of things lead to a broader discussion and enable you to not only talk about the timelessness and the universal appeal, so it is that conversation is still relevant today because of the ideas that are being explored, because they haven't changed, but it then sets up a platform for you to be able to talk about how Hughes takes these ideas and then he reshapes and he reframes them to broaden and continue that textual conversation.